I'm probably going to butcher these names, so forgive me. Some comments on Sibylle von Flatow and Friedrich Huisken's essay, quote, on the problem of the derivation of the bourgeois state, end quote, by Helmut Reichelt. Editor's introduction. Criticism of Flatow and Huisken, is a recurring theme in most of the contributions to this book, and although their long essay is not included in the selection, the main points of Flatow and Huisken's arguments and the significance of its critique is brought out in Reichelt's short essay. The distinctive feature of Flatow and Huisken's essay is their emphasis on the surface of bourgeois society as the basis for the derivation of the state form, basing themselves on the statement made by Marx and Engels in the German ideology that, quote, out of the contradiction between the particular and the common interest assumes an independent form as the state, end quote. They argue that this common or general interest, which finds its institutionalized expression in the state, must be derived from an analysis of the surface of capitalist society. To derive this general interest from simple commodity production as Projektklassenanalyse do, is to confuse the real and formal equality of simple commodity production with the merely superficial or formal equality into which it degenerates under capitalism. In capitalism, equality in the general interest in which it finds expression exists only on the surface of society. Quote, the whole bourgeois society falls apart into the surface processes of exchange on the one hand, and on the other the processes, quote, in the depths, end quote, which constantly produce unfreedom and inequality, end quote. It is from the surface of society, the realm of, quote, freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, end quote, that the state must be derived. Carrying on from where Marx left off at the end of Volume 3 of Capital, Flatow and Huisken argue on the basis of the Trinity formula, capital, profit, land, ground rent, labor, wages, from Capital Volume 3, that all members of society appear on the surface as owners of a source of revenue and have therefore a threefold interest in common: in the maintenance of the source of revenue, in the highest possible revenue from their source, and in a continuous flow of revenue. All have thus a common interest as property owners, quote, simply as private property owners, as the representatives of the general interest in the maintenance of the conditions of private property. Whatever its substance, the private property owners on the surface constitute that sphere of real appearance of equality, freedom, and independence, which conceals in itself the possibility of the development of the bourgeois state, end quote. In relation to the state, the threefold interest of the property owners become a common interest in the protection of property, assured economic growth, and the crisis-free functioning of the economy. Hence, the possibility of the state has been thus established. Its necessity is derived from the inability of the competing private property owners to realize the common interests. Having thus derived the form of the state from its most general function, administration of the general interest, rather than from a catalogue of functions which it in fact fulfills, Flatow and Huisken go on to consider the derivation of state functions, being enabled by their derivation of the state form to rephrase the question of state functions as What makes particular concrete demands arising from society acquire the status of a, quote, general interest, end quote, and be implemented through the state? It is not, they argue, a question of quantity or of the strength of the lobby behind the demand, but of the relevance of the demand to the overcoming of the barriers to capital accumulation. From this follows, inter alia, that there is no need for a general derivation of specific state functions, since what constitutes itself as state function can be analyzed only in relation to the process of accumulation and its barriers. Flatow and Huisken conclude that their argument by looking at the specific example of education in this context. Reichelt Sorry. Reichelt focused his critique of Flatow and Huisken on their use of the categories of, quote, surface and, quote, general interest, and on the ahistorical implications of such an approach. His essay raises important questions of method, and in some respects foreshadows the following essay by Hirsch. The two authors develop the argument in their essay in a very strange way. After they have discussed problems of derivation for more than 50 pages, okay, I think this is actually Reichelt speaking. This is the editor's note is ended, but it doesn't really quite say that. It just has 3 stars, so at the end of the last paragraph. So the two authors develop the argument in their essay in a very strange way. After they have discussed problems of derivation for more than 50 pages, they finally conclude that there is, quote, no longer any methodological constraint to come to a general derivation of specific state activities in our context, end quote. Once it is established that the bourgeois state in its specific form of separation from bourgeois society is to be interpreted as administrator of the general interest, and once it is further explained what these general interests are, then research can turn to the real problem and trace the course of the process of capitalist accumulation, in which the barriers to self-valorization present themselves as the real point of departure for the derivation of individual state functions. The necessity of surmounting the barriers to the valorization of total capital, appearing each time in a different shape, leads to a new state function which must develop in this specific form. What Flatow and Huisken are concerned with, therefore, is the, quote, general derivation of specific state activities, end quote, or in other words, the derivation of the bourgeois state, quote, by reasoning which goes beyond all its particular concrete functions, end quote. But what is this attempt based on if it finally emerges that the subject itself does not impose, quote, a methodological constraint to come to a general derivation, end quote? What leads the authors to construct a model in which the problem of the particular state functions and their special content is not raised, but in which the generality of these particular functions is itself made the object of a form-genetic deduction, raising for discussion a construction which finally, in the view, Jesus Christ, Sorry, everyone. My computer sucks, so forgive me. Christ on the cross. But what is this attempt based on if it finally emerges that the subject itself does not impose, quote, a methodological constraint to come to a general derivation, end quote? What leads the authors to construct a model in which the problem of the particular state functions and their special content is not raised, but in which the generality of these particular functions is itself made the object of a form genetic deduction? Raising for discussion a construction which finally, in view of the surmounting of the barriers to the valorization of capital, a surmounting alphabon, which is imposed by the compulsion of capital to valorize and which constitutes itself as state functions, proves superfluous. A construction in which a constitutive function for the genesis of the bourgeois state form is attributed to ideology, or more precisely to surface consciousness, can only avoid being superfluous if this false consciousness concerning the bourgeois state has a central role to play in the framework of a discussion of strategy. However, such a discussion is nowhere to be found in Flatow and Huisken's essay. Let us recall their argument. Against dogmatic groups, they argue that the totality of state functions cannot be explained at all as simply as is commonly done. In order to uphold the thesis of the pure class state, the state is reduced to the three traditional functions: army, police, and judiciary. Other functions in the areas of social policy, labor law, or education policy are simply dismissed as deceptions and mystification. The concept of the state must necessarily fail in any altercation with bourgeois theory, which sees the state as an essentially neutral instance concerned with the general welfare, an interpretation which, according to Flatow and Huisken, cannot be seen as deception in the sense of early bourgeois conceptions of ideology, but has a material basis. They refer to the recent widespread discussion which, quote, on the one hand, tries to come to grips with phenomenon, such as the social and infrastructural intervention of the state, and with the objective roots of the welfare state illusion, of reformist and revisionist origin, and on the other hand tries to derive as a characteristic of the bourgeois state the conceptions of freedom and equality contained above all in the concept of democracy, end quote. All that cannot be grasped adequately with a concept which reduces the state to the abstract determination, quote, class state, end quote. Flatow and Huisken see a first step towards a more subtle approach in the argument of Wolfgang Müller and Christel Neuhaus, who, basing themselves on the German ideology, explicitly describe the character of class neutrality of the bourgeois state as appearance and relate this appearance of class neutrality to the form of the bourgeois state, that is, to the form of the political state, distinct from bourgeois society and standing above it. For all that, even Müller and Neuhaus do not carry their argument far enough. They do not explain the constitution of the bourgeois state, the genesis of this particularization, the form of the separation of the state. They merely show how particular measures are carried out through the already constituted state, and are added as a new function to others already existing. Flatow and Huisken's peculiar narrowing down of the problem is already clear at this stage. It may well be that Müller and Neuhaus merely stimulate a derivation by basing themselves on analogies, but implicitly Müller and Neuhaus distinguish between derivation of the form as the, quote, real basis of this appearance, end quote, i.e. the derivation of that instance to which the appearance is to be attached, and the organ within this separated state of new functions which first bring out this appearance. In other words, with the form itself, the appearance as such is not yet posited, but it is precisely this that Flatow and Huisken do not want to recognize. Their aim is to construct a theoretical structure which will found the class character of the state not in individual functions, but in the form of particularization as such, since, so they argue, all state functions are to be located within this, quote, particularization, end quote, and thus display no qualitative difference as far as this is concerned. No criteria are to be found here for founding the class character of the state. The Marxist critique of formal law, which shows itself to be class law by formal law's very form, once the sphere of simple circulation is deciphered by the dialectical presentation of categories as the sphere of appearance, is universalized in its theoretical structure and extended to the whole state problematic. That becomes clear in their discussion of another position, that of the Projektklassenanalyse. The latter approach offers the possibility of bringing together all problems discussed so far in a single theoretical construction. The instrumental character of the state, the form of particularization, and the appearance of class neutrality can all be derived by a single line of argument. It is characteristic of the approach of Flatow and Huisken that they do not discuss at all the relation between the anticipating abstract logical discussion of the relation between economics and politics, and the subsequent interpretation of Marx's political writings in Projektklassenanalyse's treatment of the topic. They do not discuss, for example, how far such categories as, quote, doubling, end quote, general interest, etc., are meaningfully concretized in the exposition or simply thrown in as verbal affirmations. Instead, they concentrate on failings in the abstract construction, which Flatow and Huisken see in the fact that the form of particularization is located on a different methodological level from the representation of the two central functions of the state, and that the derivation of these two state functions, the state as guarantor and administrator of the general conditions of production, and as instrument of the ruling class, is not mediated with the derivation of the form of particularization. Moreover, they fail to attribute to the diluted appearance of circulation sufficient force to keep the working class under rein. Basically, Flatow and Huisken accept the construction in which false consciousness, at the surface of the process of reproduction, plays a constitutive role in the direct linking of the form of the particularization of the state with the appearance of class neutrality. But Flatow and Huisken think that they have to bring in something weightier on the side of the workers to be able to explain the, quote, stability of relations, end quote. The factual consensus can only be explained, they argue, on the basis of positive, determinable interests which are common to both workers and capital, and which find their expression in the form of the state itself, with state activity representing the administration of these common interests. The emphasis on the genesis of the form of the bourgeois state, which underlies the discussion of the various essays, and the insistence on a general derivation of the form as such, not based on particular functions, reveals itself on closer inspection as expressing the assumption of a unity which is supposed to be based on more than the ideological force of delusion, namely on a generality of interest. Flatow and Huisken are in basic agreement with the duality of appearance and essence used by Projektklassenanalyse. to found the character of neutrality of the state, but they try to give the appearance more body as the surface interests of the workers, as the workers' mode of existence as defined exclusively in bourgeois categories, a mode of existence which is later seen to be the form of the realization of the interests of total capital. Thus they write on page 130, for example, quote, "Through the historically attested, distinct and partly changing interests of the two big groups of private proprietors, there appears the boundless tendency of capital to valorize itself. More precisely, behind the interest articulated by the workers in the maintenance and continuous use of the property labor power stands the interest of total capital in the continuous productive consumption of labor power." End quote. In view of such declarations, it is hardly a coincidence that they use a model-like and unhistorical method, which in its exclusion of all history is the equal of any bourgeois model building, but which in its attempt to be, quote, above history, end quote, is painfully contemporary, and precisely in this reveals itself to be eminently historic. There are long passages where one cannot avoid the impression that this model is merely an abstract description using Marxist categories of present-day capitalism in the Federal Republic. A few years ago, such a construction would hardly have been conceivable for lack of ideological basis. The worker is presented quite unashamedly as a, quote, member of society, end quote, and a unity of society thus surreptitiously presupposed by the terms used, a unity which, if that unity of society exists at all, is of recent date. It would never have occurred to a liberal theorist of the stamp of Locke or Kant to count the worker as part of bourgeois society. He simply stood outside it, and no attempt was made to conceal the fact. Thus the identification without more ado of the subject of private law, of the abstract, quote, personality, end quote, with the owner of private property, an identification which is to be found in Hegel's philosophy of right, but which there is attributable to the unavoidable world historical limits on knowledge, and to this extent has its historical justification, is seen as the product of necessarily false consciousness. Moreover, citizenship of the state is abstractly attributed to Flatow and Huisken, to every worker, without even a word being said about the historical process that led to this. But the most striking thing of all is that a central category of the whole bourgeois democratic tradition, a category which is still used in his radical democratic phase by the young Marx still caught in Feuerbachian thinking, but which is used only in an emancipatory context, namely the category of the, quote, general interest, end quote, is systematically deprived of its emancipatory dimension and used as an analytical category which serves only to provide an interpretation of that which can be institutionalized in the bourgeois state as the expression of a supra-individual interest. Much the same can be said for the category of, quote, doubling, end quote, Verdoppelung. Neither in the circular number 3 of the Erlangen group, nor in the Projektklassenanalyse, nor in Flatow and Huisken's essay is any mention at all made of the radical democratic image of human liberation connected with this category. Significantly, the category is used only by analogy with the categorical representation of the value and money theory and the meaning developed there, significantly because the orientation towards that particular structure of derivation presupposes that, just as in the value theory, the unity, the general, is identified as positive. The dialectical representation of particularization, the theoretical portrayal of the removal of the general to a particular existence, standing, quote, alongside and outside, end quote, the particular commodities, postulates in advance that the two moments, the general and the particular, exist in immediate unity. The rest of the construction is built up according to the same pattern, fulfilling always two essential requirements. First, a general interest must be identified which unites all who take part in the process of reproduction. And second, the dimension of false consciousness must be sealed as tightly as possible against the possible insight that the pursuit by the workers of their own interest is already the realization of the interests of capital. The constellation of categories described by Marx as the surface of the reproduction process seemed to Flatow and Huisken best able to satisfy these requirements. In competition, so Marx says repeatedly in Capital, everything appears in reverse. The real relations are recognizable only in distorted and mystified shape. The way in which the whole process appears to the practical capitalist and to the worker is not identical with its real shape. The quote, Trinity formula, end quote, at the end of the third volume, which in Flatow and Huisken's eyes closes the systematic analysis of the 3 volumes, opens the way, according to them, to an analysis which satisfies the second requirement mentioned above. In a, quote, excursus on method, end quote, is therefore explained that an exact derivation of the form of the bourgeois state must always bear in mind that, in like manner to Marx's treatment in Capital of credit, which although it is often mentioned beforehand, has its logical place only at a later stage of the total analysis, the state too can be derived with logical correctness only at a certain stage of the development of the concept of capital. Quote, it is not enough either to name the general preconditions for the existence of the state, which are implicit in the development of the concept of capital, or to try to constitute the state as the sum of its factual activities. Rather, the methodological point of departure must be found from which the state becomes necessary in its real existence, from which, to take an expression used by Marx in a different context, the, quote, inner tendency, end quote, comes forward as, quote, external necessity, end quote, in the course of the systematic development of the argument, end quote. Thus, with the help of an argument by Marx which refers exclusively to the relation between the laws of capital and their realization through the competition of individual capitals, which is not to be understood as though, at every stage of the systematic analysis, the analysis of this, quote, inner nature, end quote, of capital necessarily drives on the basis of some internal dynamic towards the development of, quote, external necessity, end quote. With the help of this quotation, the, quote, methodological soil, end quote, is prepared for the subsequent derivation of the form of the state, which uses to some extent the same concepts, and at the same time the correctness of their own procedure is suggested. For after all, it should appear logically necessary that this derivation of the form of the state should take as its starting point the end of the third volume of Capital. As a result of the discussions of the Erlangen theory group, Flatow and Huisken think that they can interpret this conceptual determination of false consciousness without more ado as the attitude of the worker as a private property owner, putting him in the same on the same qualitative footing as the capitalist, and thus allowing one for the first time to impute identical interest to them, but also raising doubts about the two authors' grasp of the Marxist method. Characteristic in this respect are the reinterpretation of Marx's arguments and a degree of uncertainty in their conceptualization, thus basing themselves directly on value theory and hence on a method which traces the form determinations of social objectivity. They postulate a, quote, equality, end quote, Gleichgelten, of all those taking part in the reproduction process. But this, quote, equality, end quote, of private property owners is developed in a form which suppresses the specific dialectic of the sphere of simple circulation, and above all, its dimension as a critique of ideology. Even at the risk of my being accused of, quote, Marx scholasticism, end quote, it must be said that Marx did not characterize either money or the commodity, and certainly not capital, as a thing and the worker or capitalist as keeper or bearer of this thing. But such a misunderstanding is quite logical in the context of Flatow and Huisken's interpretation. Their presentation of the dialectic of form and content with regard to the exchange relation is only possible because they once again fall into the trap of actual reification. Thus, a capitalist exchanges his money capital for the capital of another capitalist. In this case, they see the equality of exchange as being maintained not only formally, but also in content, because capital is exchanged for capital. Quote, the property of both is qualitatively the same, is capital, end quote. Capital is thus merely a thing. Capital, in my understanding of Marx, circulates in the shape of a constant change of form. Capital's existence is process. Capital is the unity of capital's forms. Capital is the constant change between the form of generality and the form of particularity, of money and commodity, and the problem of political economy is precisely to explain increase in this constant change of form, which value the equivalent goes through. Marx speaks with good reason of a purely formal distinction, namely the distinction between the form of generality and the form of particularity. The content use value is outside the economic form because it immediately coincides with the economic form. The distinction between content and form becomes economically significant only when the exchange between capital and labor is considered. Yet Flatow and Huisken's interpretation of precisely this act is incomprehensible, or at least comprehends the above interpretation only by negative implication, insofar as equality is now said to be maintained, quote, merely formally, end quote. How far real equivalents are exchanged in this case, and the term, quote, exchange, end quote, is identical with the change of equivalents, and can only refer to this, it hardly seems possible to me that one could interpret on the basis of Marx's work an exchange of capital for capital as being qualitatively capital. How far exploitation is accomplished through the form of the real exchange of equivalents. To explain this and thereby to portray the real exchange of equivalents as appearance is one of the focal points of Marx's theory. Equally unclear is Flatow and Huisken's interpretation of the processes going on, quote, below the surface, end quote, in the property and appropriation relations of production and reproduction, end quote, as though property were not identical with the right of appropriating surplus value without equivalent, although mediated by the exchange of equivalents. Flatow and Huisken's concept of property, like their concept of capital, refers to a mere thing. However, they may picture to themselves the appropriation going on, quote, beneath the surface, end quote. The course of logical presentation in Capital is, in their view, to be interpreted as meaning that at the end of the third volume the contradiction between, quote, property and non-property, end quote, which according to their own conception should not exist, since the worker is also a property owner, is, quote, logically subsumed, end quote, in the fetishized forms of the surface, which no longer show any trace of this contradiction. The inadequacy of these considerations. One second. The inadequacy of these considerations also helps to explain those parts of their article in which Flatow and Huisken come out against the anchoring of bourgeois conceptions of freedom and equality in the sphere of simple circulation. Their understanding of this sphere is in line with their reified conception of property and capital. Quote, under the conditions of simple commodity circulation, end quote, they write, quote, freedom and equality referred to the formal act of circulation and also to circulation's preconditions of content, property relation, intention, form of appropriation, when the separation of property from labor represents the basis of the mode of production and posits the characteristic contradiction between property and non-property, neither the concept of freedom nor that of equality can be retained in their comprehensive sense, embracing form and content of simple commodity circulation, end quote. Obviously, Flatow and Huisken think of simple commodity circulation as the ideal of petty commodity producers. The conception of freedom and equality is seen as arising not just from the act of circulation, but also from real conditions of production, thus free cultivation of the fields, property understood in fetishized categories of about equal size, moderate and approximate equal fortunes of the artisans, etc., so that one could appropriate the products of the work of one's fellow only by giving in return the products of one's own work. If this image is at the basis of their analysis, and the passage quoted allows of no other interpretation, then Flatow and Huisken are reproducing in classical form the ideology which Marx criticized unsparingly with the dialectic of appearance and essence, on which the authors claim to base themselves. In logical form, they make the same mistake as bourgeois theory makes when it is unable to understand the determinate forms peculiar to the sphere of circulation as being just such forms, and instead fill them with a sensuous content. We need only refer to the many theories of the, quote, natural condition, end quote, that paradise of free and equal persons which has never existed and which even in bourgeois theory is seen through as being merely hypothetical. But Flatow and Huisken reproduce this hypothesis in all seriousness in a time in which, God knows, it has lost all world historical substance. Once the division into classes comes into being, then, according to Flatow and Huisken, the conception of freedom and equality can only be based on the intrinsically false consciousness of the private property owner who mistakenly sees himself as a proud bourgeois subject, and who, by reason of the distorting force of the fetishized forms of the surface, shares identical general interest on a wide range of issues with all other property owners. The false consciousness on the surface is, in the view of the two authors, so hermetically sealed in its conceptual structure against every possible insight into real relations that the worker must mistakenly understand himself as a property owner, and therefore act in the pursuit of his bourgeois interests as the unconscious executor of total capitalist interests. In his delusion, the worker relates to his labor power in the same way as the capitalist relates to his capital, understood as a thing which throws off income in the same form, money form. The interests which he articulates are likewise indistinguishable from those to which the capitalist gives expression. The complete homo economicus, he has an interest in the maintenance of this source of revenue, an interest in as high a revenue as possible and in the continuous flow of the same. Everyone knows that he can acquire this revenue only through the use of his particular material source of income. He can employ it, however, and thus acquire income only when he tries at the same time to protect the general preconditions within which he reproduces himself. Thus, independent of the material nature of their source of income, all private property owners have a general interest in securing the conditions which make possible the realization of the three interests based on the three particular sources of income. Their unity is the abstractly uniting interest in securing the preconditions which determine the relation of income source and income in its three component parts. To this extent, they distinguish between themselves as being interested in the general welfare and as citizens pursuing particular interests which relate to their particular source of income. Quote, private property owners thus exist in a twofold manner, as private property owners with particular interests and as representatives of general interests. To this doubling corresponds the doubling into private property owner and citizen, or, referring to private property owners as a whole, the doubling of society into state and society, end quote. Whereas, quote, doubling, end quote, for the young Marx was the shaking off of the particular bourgeois reality and the constitution of the abstract existence as citizen, citoyen, as member of the state seen as the emancipation, though still in limited abstract political form of humanity from nature like prehistory, this better half of the, quote, double man, end quote, is concentrated in Flatow Huisken's essay on, believe it or not, the protection of private property as general interest in the maintenance of the source of revenue, guaranteed economic growth as general interest in the preconditions for the largest possible creation of new value to be divided up and distributed, and the, quote, crisis-free functioning of the economy, end quote, as precondition for the continuous flow of revenue. The rest of the argument can be anticipated. The doubling into society and state results from the unmediated unity and plurality, of generality and particularity. The possibility, as Flatow and Huisken put it, of the separation of bourgeois state from bourgeois society rests on the unity, the general interest. The necessity of the real doubling, of the real sundering, rests on the fact that their own unity is such, i.e. their general interest as general interest, can neither be recognized nor attained by the private property owners, whose eyes are fixed on the particularity of their own interests. There must, therefore, be an instance which recognizes and realizes the contents of the general interest and presents itself in particular shape as administrator of the general. The unity of private property owners presents itself in particular form as the state. This, quote, general derivation, end quote, as Flatow and Huisken call it, which presents the state in a reasoning process which glides over all its actual functions, then contains also the answer to the question posed at the beginning, how the state in the form of its particularization, and not only in its individual particular state functions, can be both class state and class-neutral state at the same time. The mediation of both aspects is possible on the basis of the inherently distorting functions of objective forms of appearance on the surface of the total process, which not only has the effect of making the mode of existence of empirical living subjects appear to those subjects themselves exclusively as the mode of existence of private property owners, but in addition leads the workers acting with this consciousness to pursue real, particular, and general interests as private property owners. The state is then also their state as long as they do not recognize that their own interests as private property owners are identical with the interests of total capital. Once they gain some insight into the function of their false consciousness, the mirage is destroyed, they recognize their supposedly own state as the state of capital, which secures the general conditions of the reproduction of capital and thus accumulation. An instrument of the ruling class, the aspect emphasized both by the dogmatic groups and by theories of state monopoly capitalism, is precisely what the state is not in this form of separation, in which it can, after all, turn also against the class of capital owners, but only in times of class struggle, when the class of genuine property owners acts in union with the state to beat back the attacks of the proletariat on all levels. What can have led Flatow and Huisken to construct a model in which an actually existing consensus and stability, attained by whatever means, are presented as the outcome and expression of a general interest which has always suited all private property owners? What was it that brought Flatow and Huisken not only to define as an ever-present, quote, general interest, end quote, the obvious fact that there will certainly be conflict if the efforts to secure, quote, steady growth, end quote, and a, quote, crisis-free functioning of the economy, end quote, are not crowned with success, but also to reinterpret this fact ontologically as a general interest which is specific also to the workers as private property owners, and which, quote, has always lain hidden in the economic relations, end quote. The whole undertaking gives one the impression that a specific interpretation of a quite specific process going on at the moment is being generalized with the help of Marxist categories. Flatow and Huisken see the plight of education has to be related to the structure of the process of capital expansion in the present constellation. The state-controlled reform of education is an attempt to overcome by administrative means a barrier to the process of accumulation and valorization. This barrier manifests itself in part in the fact that many people are wrongly or insufficiently qualified and demand more education and equality of opportunity. Flatow and Huisken explain all this as follows. The total process permeates the conscious actions of the participants. The fact that people want to see equality of opportunity, better education, etc., realized as a right guaranteed by the Constitution shows that not only do they not recognize that these demands raised by them at a particular time are the expression of a barrier to the process of valorization, but that moreover they are making demands which are to be understood as being exclusively in the interest of long-term stabilization of capital as a whole. On this basis, the authors then develop a model which, as the examples which they feel justified in drawing from the first volume of Capital show, can claim validity for the whole history of bourgeois society. We have no wish to deny that Flatow and Huisken's essay brings together for the first time the various aspects of Marx's state theory in a unified construction which certainly advances the discussion. It must be questioned, however, whether a methodologically legitimate critique has to lead to a construction in which the problem of explaining political stability is thrown together without mediation with the derivation of state functions. This improper combination is the central weakness of the essay. They criticize Altvatter's procedure for subsuming the various state functions and state activities under a preconceived system of categories, and in such a way that both the system of categories and the ordering of the various state functions in this framework are contradictory. In contrast, Flatow and Huisken insist that the state functions must be developed in their genesis and in their inner materially founded interrelation. For this purpose, the barriers to the process of valorization, implicitly and explicitly named in Marx's presentation of the general concept of capital, general concept of capital, quote, seem to act as signposts indicating the way to a systematic portrayal of the genesis of state functions. It is an attempt, in other words, to understand Marx's concept of capital and its logic of presentation as a guideline for the writing of real history, an attempt which in the development of state functions moves on a plane of methodological reflection corresponding to the plane on which Marx moved in his critique of political economy. This attempt is, of course, not to be considered without striving to give information in methodically appropriate form about the particular shape in which the functions determined by the process of valorization as a whole must consolidate, i.e. appear as state functions. The state, so the authors argued against Altvater, must not be brought in as a stopgap or a fact of experience. It must be presented positively in its imminent necessity. But why must this be done in the framework of a, quote, general derivation, end quote, which discusses only the essence of the bourgeois state, developing the form of the state in a derivation which glides over the individual functions? Would it not have been sufficient to discuss the basic concept of the form discussion, the contradictory unity of particular and general, in relation to each individual function in its specific shape as state function? Without demonstrating in an abstract general manner the general in all these functions, namely that they are state functions, or in Flatow and Huisken's words, that it is a question of the general interest being administered in a specific form, the same result could be reached if it were shown that, on the basis of a duality of particular and common interests, a separate institutional particularization of state functions must take place. However such an understanding might appear in detail, however such an undertaking might appear in detail, it would not in any case be burdened with questionable analytical ballast and metaphysical implications, which result from the aim of deriving the bourgeois state forms in abstract general manner, and it seems to me from the never explicitly declared interest in explaining political stability. A careful reading of the essay also reveals that the authors hardly pursued to its conclusion their approach, which they declared towards the end to be, quote, superfluous, end quote. They leave unexplained the methodological status of the concept of, quote, general interest, end quote, direct reference to Marx's formulations, which are primarily to be found in the Grundrisse and the explanation of the character masks acting in simple circulation, and the conceptions which arise there, suggesting that the aim to extend Marx's method of portraying social objectivity, yet in contrast, Flatow and Huisken use the concept exclusively as an all-embracing concept, which, using the method of logical subsumption, brings together abstractly in the three interests mentioned maintenance of the source of revenue, the highest possible revenue, and a continuous flow, all conceivable and historically developing actions for securing bourgeois reproduction, leaving aside the fact that it is presumptuous to imagine an, quote, as yet undiscovered, end quote, interest of the worker in, quote, steady growth and a crisis-free functioning of the economy, end quote, which the worker is unable to distinguish consciously from his particular interest, and which on the other hand is supposed to appear in the formal structure of its implementation as, quote, his state, end quote, It should follow logically from such an approach that the abstract content of this general interest should autonomize itself as a particular institutional consolidation distinct from the immediate process of reproduction. That is, of course, unthinkable, but as a hypothetical construction, it closes the conceptual gap in Flatow and Huisken's approach. Of the form of the state, they can only assert that it is the necessary form of the administration of general interests. They can only begin to fulfill their promises concretely when it is a question of definite interests, which is tautologically subsumable under one of the three general interests. In the process, the two authors let drop some revealing formulations, such as when they speak of a, quote, more or less general interest on the surface, end quote, so the concept of the general interest is no longer taken seriously analytically, but merely ascribed an ideology, critical dimension. In the transition to the investigation of the barriers resulting from the process of the valorization of capital and of the transcending Aufbebung of these barriers, and overcoming which develops into state functions, it becomes clear what is involved in this concept of general interest. It is ideology. Quote, at this point it becomes clear that the concept of democracy based on quantitative determinations is incompatible with the necessity, which often ignores just these quantitative majority relations, for the bourgeois state to implement interests which would find no majority among the people, end quote. In other words, there are no general interests, but only particular interests which are declared to be general. It is thus implicitly admitted that the postulated unity of the general interest was only invented in order to derive the form of the state in an abstract and overarching manner, the form of a state of which it is said at the same time that its institutional frame is to be understood as a particular form of the overcoming of the barriers to the valorization of capital as a whole. Moreover, it is not clear, in their view, whether the politically mediated overcoming of ever new barriers to valorization, a process which presents itself as the accumulation of state functions, leads to an instance characterized by contradictions in which the individual functions hamper and paralyze one another in their effects. Only if the underlying history of the valorization of capital as a whole is brought into the discussion, capital always being structured by the opposition between wage labor and capital, does it seem possible to understand these functions, which are not unequivocally referable to definite class relations, as being nevertheless not class neutral in their formal structure. Only on this basis can one try to grasp that, on the contrary, precisely in this, their form, as even mutually contradictory state functions, their unity lies in their class character. But that is precisely what Flatow and Huisken's concept of the general interest does not achieve, since it serves in a construction developed purely on the level of affirmation to anchor the class character of every state function in the dimension of the worker who misconceives himself as bourgeois. Indeed, this concept disastrously impedes an adequate understanding of historical processes. It is in the nature of the construction that the possibility of discussing definite measures, e.g. of social policy, as the outcome of strategic consideration, it is in the nature of the construction that the possibility of discussing definite measures, e.g. of social policy, as the outcome of strategic considerations, is a priori excluded. Such measures must instead be attributed to the general interest of the worker in private property, which, in its determinate articulation, is to be understood as the expression of a barrier to the expansion of capital, a barrier deeply felt by the workers. If, on the other hand, quote, bourgeois democracy, is supposed to be, the form most adequate to the capitalist state for the implementation of interest and the exercise of politics, because it espouses most purely the principle of equality, end quote, then the resistance of the bourgeoisie to universal suffrage can clearly only have been based on a misunderstanding of its own state, which was interpreted by the bourgeoisie as its state, as a class state, and sealed against proletariat influence only because it, the bourgeoisie, happened by chance to have articulated and asserted its general interest first, and the proletariat had not yet made its contribution to, quote, supporting the state, end quote.